I didn't really want to go. That was my first thought when Eric handed me the keys to his cabin. It wasn't anything fancy. A little A-frame out in the woods by a small lake. Quiet, isolated. Perfect for some peace, he had said, which was exactly the problem. I wasn't in the mood for quiet, but I needed it. I was burnt out. My head felt like it had been spinning for months. Work, traffic, bills, the endless stream of notifications that never stopped buzzing in my pocket. The idea of disconnecting seemed almost unbearable, but deep down, I knew that's why I had to do it. The cabin was about a 3-hour drive from the city. As I got closer, the road narrowed and twisted through dense pine trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air smelled clean, sharp with the scent of evergreens and damp earth. I rolled down my window and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the creeping unease that had settled in my chest. It was just a weekend. The cabin appeared suddenly at the end of a gravel road, tucked between the trees like it had grown there. It was small but sturdy looking, with weathered wooden siding and a steep roof. A thin layer of moss clung to the shingles. There was a dock out back that stretched into the lake, the water dark and still. I parked, grabbed my duffel bag, and stood for a moment, listening. No cars.
No voices.
Just the wind in the trees and the occasional creak of branches rubbing together. It felt too quiet. I shook it off, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The interior was simple. One large room with a small kitchen in the corner, a couch facing an old wood stove, and a bed tucked against the far wall. There was a smell of stale wood smoke and something else I couldn't quite place, but it wasn't unpleasant. I dropped my bag by the door and checked my phone. No signal. Of course, I muttered. There was a landline on the wall by the kitchen, but I didn't bother checking if it worked. I had promised myself no screens, no calls, no distractions. Just me, the cabin, and some time to clear my head. I spent the first few hours unpacking, sweeping out some cobwebs, and stacking firewood by the stove. I found an old lantern in the corner and lit it, watching the flame flicker and dance behind the glass. It made the cabin feel smaller, cozier somehow. By the time the sun started to set, I was actually starting to relax. The light turned the lake into a sheet of copper, and the trees cast long shadows across the water. I sat on the dock for a while, letting my feet dangle over the edge, listening to the soft lap of the water against the wood. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. I first noticed it just after dark. A sound, faint but distinct, a soft rustling in the trees behind the cabin. I told myself it was the wind, but something about it felt off, too steady, too deliberate. I stood at the window for a long time, staring into the darkness. The lantern cast just enough light to reflect my face in the glass, but beyond that, there was nothing but black. I thought about stepping outside, but the thought made my skin crawl. Instead, I locked the door. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the cabin felt too loud, every gust of wind too sharp. I kept waking up, heart racing, convinced I'd heard something. But when I listened, all I could hear was the wind and the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. By morning, I felt ridiculous. It was just a cabin in the woods. The sounds were probably animals, raccoons maybe, or deer. I made coffee, sat on the dock, and tried to convince myself I wasn't being paranoid. It worked for a while. Later that afternoon, I decided to go for a walk. There was a trail behind the cabin that wound through the woods and eventually looped back around to the lake. The air was cool and smelled like pine needles. The trail was narrow, but well-worn, with patches of moss and fallen leaves soft underfoot. I had just reached the halfway point when I saw it. The footprint. It was pressed into a patch of mud just off the trail. Fresh, human. I stopped, staring at it. It wasn't mine. I hadn't been this far yet, and the print was too large to belong to Eric. I looked around, heart pounding. The trees crowded close, their branches tangled together overhead. There was no sound, no sign of anyone else, but the footprint was there, clear as day. Turned and walked back to the cabin, faster than I probably should have. That night, the sound came back. This time, it wasn't just rustling. There were footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I sat on the couch, every muscle in my body tense, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped by the front door. I held my breath. A long, agonizing moment passed. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. Whatever peace I had hoped to find here wasn't worth the growing sense of dread that gnawed at my stomach. I packed my bag, threw it in the car, and turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, but I didn't know what I was looking for. Everything looked fine. The battery was connected. There was gas in the tank. It should have started. I went back inside and picked up the landline. Dead. Panic clawed at my throat. I tried to stay calm, telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe the battery was just old, and the phone line had been down for years. But deep down, I didn't believe it. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself. Reading, stacking firewood, pacing the cabin until my legs ached. But every time I sat still, I found myself staring at the window, waiting for the sound to come back. It didn't disappoint. This time it was louder, closer. I grabbed the lantern and a heavy piece of firewood, holding it like a club. I stood by the window, watching the darkness, trying to spot movement between the trees. My breath fogged up the glass. Then I saw it, a shape just beyond the tree line. It was too far away to make out any details, but it was definitely a person. Standing still, watching. My mouth went dry. I raised the firewood, my knuckles white around the handle. The figure didn't move. I don't know how long I stood there, heart hammering in my chest, before it finally turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even try. I sat in the middle of the cabin, the lantern flickering on the floor beside me, every muscle in my body wound tight. I kept waiting for the footsteps to come back, but they never did. When the sun finally rose, I grabbed my bag and started walking. The road was empty, the gravel crunching under my boots the only sound. I walked for what felt like hours, the trees blurring together around me. Every time I heard a branch snap or a bird call, I froze, waiting for the figure to step out from the trees. But it never did. Eventually, I saw a truck coming down the road. I stepped into the middle of the road and waved my arms until the driver slowed down. He was an older man with a thick beard and kind eyes. I must have looked like a maniac, sweaty, wild-eyed, clutching my bag like it was a life raft. "You okay, son?" he asked. "Car broke down," I said, my voice hoarse. "Can you give me a ride?" He nodded, and I climbed into the truck, sinking into the worn leather seat with a shaky breath. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. It stood there, silent and still, the lake gleaming behind it. I never went back. I never found out who was in the woods that night or what they wanted. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed late at night, I hear footsteps outside my window, and I wonder if they ever really stopped following me. I can still feel the cold seeping into my bones, even now, thinking back on that night. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a weekend at a cabin. A chance to get away from the noise of the city and clear my head. I needed it. Work had been suffocating, and life in general felt like a weight pressing down on me. I thought a few days alone in the woods would be good for my soul. Fresh air, no phone calls, no emails, just me and nature. I rented a small cabin deep in the woods. It was one of those rustic places, no fancy amenities, just the basics. A wood stove for heat, a small kitchen with outdated appliances, and a creaky bed that looked like it had seen better days. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service. That was the whole point. Disconnect completely. I remember standing on the porch when I first arrived, breathing in the crisp, pine-scented air. For the first time in weeks, I felt a little lighter. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked, chopped some firewood, and took a walk through the surrounding woods. It was peaceful, almost eerily so. The kind of quiet that wraps around you and makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. Leaves crunching underfoot, the distant rustle of branches in the wind, the occasional bird call. I liked it. Felt like the kind of solitude I'd been craving. As evening fell, I started a fire in the stove and cooked a simple meal. Just some pasta and canned sauce. I ate on the porch, watching the sun dip below the trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The air grew colder quickly once the sun was gone, and I retreated inside, piling extra wood into the stove to keep the chill at bay. I read for a while by the light of an old oil lamp, then crawled into bed, listening to the crackling fire as I drifted off to sleep. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, disoriented. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was cold, colder than it should have been. I could see my breath in the dim light filtering through the curtains. Something felt off. I lay there for a moment, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic thumping sound coming from outside. I sat up, heart pounding. It could have been anything, a branch knocking against the cabin, an animal moving around outside. But it didn't quite sound like that. It was too steady, too deliberate. I told myself I was being paranoid. I'd read too many horror stories, watched too many late-night thrillers. Still, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. Grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand, I got out of bed and padded to the window. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and the dirt path leading up to the cabin. Nothing, just shadows and silence. I told myself to calm down. It was probably just a raccoon or a deer. I was in the middle of the woods, after all. Animals were bound to wander by. I checked the lock on the door secure. The windows were all shut tight. Satisfied, I climbed back into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin. The thumping had stopped, but my nerves were still on edge. Took a long time for sleep to find me again. The next morning, I felt silly for how jumpy I'd been. In the daylight, everything seemed perfectly normal. I made coffee and stood on the porch, watching the woods come alive with the soft light of dawn. Birds flitted through the trees, their songs filling the air. I decided to spend the day hiking, exploring the area around the cabin. I wanted to soak in as much of the peaceful surroundings as I could. By late afternoon, clouds had rolled in, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. I made my way back to the cabin, my legs aching from the long hike. The air felt heavy, almost electric, like a storm was brewing. Back inside, I lit the stove again and settled in with a book. Rain started to patter against the roof, a soothing sound that made me feel safe and cozy. It was around dusk when I noticed something strange. I'd left my backpack by the door when I came in from my hike, but now it was sitting on the kitchen table. I frowned, trying to remember if I'd moved it. Maybe I had and just forgot. I've been tired after all. Still, it nagged at me. I went to the door and peered outside. The rain had stopped, but the ground was wet and muddy. I glanced down at the porch and froze. Footprints. Fresh footprints in the mud, leading up to the door, and not mine. These were larger, heavier. My pulse quickened. I hadn't seen anyone all day, not since I'd arrived. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? I locked the door, double-checking it this time. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was a hiker who got lost, someone seeking shelter from the rain. That would make sense, wouldn't it? But why hadn't they knocked? Why move my bag and then leave without a word? I spent the rest of the evening on edge, every little sound setting my nerves on fire. I kept the flashlight within arm's reach, along with the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. I told myself I was being ridiculous, letting my imagination get the best of me. But some primal part of my brain refused to relax. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell into a restless sleep. I woke up again in the middle of the night, heart hammering in my chest. This time, it wasn't a sound that woke me. It was the feeling of being watched. My skin crawled, every hair on my body standing on end. The room was dark, the fire reduced to faintly glowing embers. I reached for the flashlight and flicked it on, the beam sweeping across the room. Then I saw it. The door, unlocked, standing open a few inches. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I'd locked it. I was sure of it. Panic surged through me as I scanned the room, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But there was no one, just the open door and the cold night air seeping in. I bolted out of bed, slamming the door shut and locking it again. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to turn the lock. I pressed my back against the door, struggling to catch my breath. My mind was racing. Someone had been inside the cabin while I slept. They could still be out there, watching, waiting. I stayed up the rest of the night, clutching the iron poker like a lifeline. Every creak of the old cabin made me jump, my heart thudding in my chest. I counted down the hours until dawn, each minute stretching into an eternity. When the first light of day finally crept through the windows, I sprang into action. I packed my things in record time, throwing everything into my bag without bothering to fold or organize. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. As I stepped onto the porch, I scanned the surrounding woods, my eyes darting from tree to tree. The footprints were still there, partially washed away by the rain but unmistakable. My stomach churned. I didn't wait to see if anyone was watching. I hurried to my car, threw my bag in the back, and peeled out down the dirt road, gravel kicking up behind me. My heart didn't stop racing until I was miles away from the cabin, back on the main road. Even then, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. It wasn't until I was back in the city, surrounded by people and noise, that I finally started to breathe normally again. I don't know who it was or what they wanted. Maybe it was just a drifter looking for shelter, or some harmless prankster trying to scare me. But I'll never forget the feeling of waking up to that open door, the cold air creeping in, and the knowledge that someone had been there, watching me while I slept. I haven't been back to the woods since, and I don't think I ever will. It started with the need to get away. Work was dragging me down, and life in the city felt suffocating. I needed air, real air, not the kind pumped through vents and mixed with exhaust fumes. So, I booked a cabin far from civilization. It wasn't one of those trendy, modern places with Wi-Fi and a hot tub. No, this one was old, secluded, and basic. Just a small structure tucked deep in the woods, miles from the nearest paved road. The photos online made it look rustic and charming. Weathered wooden beams, a stone fireplace, a little kitchen with mismatched dishes. Exactly what I thought I needed. I packed light, a few days' worth of clothes, some food, a book I'd been meaning to read, and a bottle of whiskey for the long nights. I drove out on a Friday afternoon, leaving the noise and stress behind me. The farther I got from the city, the more I could feel my shoulders relax. The air smelled cleaner, the sky seemed wider, and the trees stood tall and quiet on either side of the road. By the time I turned onto the narrow dirt path that led to the cabin, I felt almost peaceful. The cabin was exactly as advertised. Small, a little weather-beaten, but sturdy. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. I parked my car and carried my bag inside. The inside was cozy but sparse. A small kitchen with a propane stove and a tiny fridge. A living area with a worn couch and a coffee table scarred with old rings from cups long forgotten. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a narrow staircase led up to a loft with a bed and a single window that looked out into the woods. There was no TV, no internet, and no cell service. Perfect. I unpacked my bag, stacking my clothes on a shelf near the bed and putting my food in the fridge. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine, a mix of old fires and the surrounding forest. It felt welcoming in its own rough way. That first evening was quiet. I made a simple dinner on the stove and ate at the small table by the window. The light outside faded slowly, the sky turning from blue to deep orange to black. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I lit a fire in the fireplace, poured myself a glass of whiskey, and settled onto the couch with my book. The fire crackled softly, and the warmth filled the cabin. I lost track of time, caught up in the story. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke with a start to find the fire reduced to glowing embers and the cabin shrouded in darkness. For a moment, I sat there, disoriented. The only light came from the faint glow of the dying fire. The woods outside were silent. I shook off the lingering sleepiness and climbed the stairs to the loft. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and I fell asleep almost instantly. The next morning, I woke early. Sunlight streamed through the window, and the air was cool and crisp. I brewed a cup of coffee and stepped outside onto the small porch. The forest felt alive in a way it hadn't the night before. Birds flitted from tree to tree, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of running water. I decided to explore. Was a trail behind the cabin, barely more than a narrow path worn into the underbrush. It wound through the trees, the ground soft beneath my feet. The forest smelled fresh, like damp earth and leaves. I followed the trail for what felt like miles, passing tall pines and moss-covered rocks. Eventually, I came to a small stream. The water was clear and cold, bubbling over smooth stones. I spent a while there, sitting on a fallen log and watching the water. It felt good to be away from everything, to have nothing to do but exist in the moment. I stayed until the sun climbed higher in the sky, then made my way back to the cabin. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. The door to the cabin was open. Not wide open, just slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it when I left. I paused at the edge of the clearing, my heart picking up speed. For a moment, I listened, straining to hear anything unusual, but the forest was quiet. Cautiously, I approached the cabin. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding small and out of place in the stillness. There was no answer. I pushed the door open all the way and stepped inside. Everything looked exactly as I had left it. My bag was still on the floor near the couch, and the dishes from breakfast were in the sink. Nothing seemed out of place. Told myself I must not have latched the door properly. It was an old cabin, after all. Maybe the wind had pushed it open. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled in my chest. I locked the door and checked the windows just to be safe. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I read more of my book, took another walk, and made dinner as the sun set. But that night, I couldn't relax the way I had before. I kept glancing at the door, expecting it to swing open at any moment. The next morning, I woke to find the front door open again. This time, I knew I had locked it. My heart raced as I stood on the loft, staring down at the open door. The forest outside was bathed in early morning light, but it felt darker somehow, more oppressive. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a cast iron skillet from the kitchen, and crept downstairs. I checked every corner of the cabin, even the tiny closet under the stairs. Nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints on the porch, nothing to explain how the door had opened. I considered leaving right then and there, but part of me didn't want to give in to fear. It was probably something simple. Maybe the lock was faulty, or the door frame had warped over time. I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind against the windows set my nerves on edge. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke to the sound of footsteps outside. They were soft, barely more than a whisper against the ground, but unmistakable. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, deliberately. They paused near the front door, then moved toward the back. I stayed perfectly still, listening. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? A lost hiker? But deep down, I knew it was neither. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I strained to hear anything, but the night was still. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Time lost all meaning in the dark. Finally, I heard the footsteps retreat into the woods. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn filtered through the window. I left that morning. I didn't bother packing everything, just grabbed my essentials and threw them into my bag. As I stepped outside, the forest seemed to watch me. The trees stood tall and silent, their shadows long in the early light. I didn't look back as I drove away, the cabin disappearing into the trees behind me. Later, when I was back in the safety of my apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I researched the area, trying to find anything that might explain what had happened. There were no reports of break-ins or strange activity. No legends or local stories about the cabin. Just silence. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. Maybe it was just my imagination, fueled by isolation and too much time alone. Or maybe it was something else, something I'll never understand. I haven't been back to the woods since. As I sat there, catching my breath, I noticed something. A faint sound, barely audible over the wind. It was rhythmic, deliberate. Footsteps, coming from the trees outside. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the door. Silence followed. Heavy, oppressive silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my body refused to obey. The handle of the door rattled once, twice, then stopped. Another long pause. Then the footsteps retreated, fading into the forest. I stayed there for what felt like hours, my back pressed against the wall, waiting for the sound to return. But it never did. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, the forest was still, empty. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my pack and left the cabin, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. I didn't care which direction I was going anymore, as long as it was away from there. My legs burned, my lungs heaved, but I kept moving, driven by a single primal urge to get out. Hours later, just as the last light was fading, I stumbled onto a gravel road. Relief flooded through me. I followed it, my steps uneven, my mind numb with exhaustion. Eventually, headlights appeared in the distance. A car, the first sign of civilization I'd seen in 2 days. The driver was kind enough to stop and give me a ride back to the trailhead. I didn't say much during the drive, just stared out the window, my thoughts a jumble. When we reached my car, I thanked him and collapsed into the driver's seat, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty trailhead. Part of me wanted to go back to make sense of what had happened. But another part, the smarter part, knew better. Some places weren't meant to be understood. Some trails were better left unexplored. I started the car and drove away, the forest fading into the distance behind me. I'm not sure why I thought renting a cabin in the middle of nowhere was a good idea. At first, it seemed perfect. A chance to get away from the constant hum of city life, to breathe in some fresh air, and clear my head. I found the cabin online, advertised as a secluded spot in the middle of dense forestland. No neighbors, no traffic, no noise. Just what I needed, or so I thought. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive itself was peaceful, winding through narrow country roads surrounded by towering trees. The sun was beginning to set when I finally pulled up to the cabin. It was small but sturdy, with weathered wood siding and a steep roof. It looked old but well-maintained, the kind of place you'd imagine someone built with their own hands years ago and passed down through generations. I killed the engine and stepped out of the car. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It was quiet, unnervingly so. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The trees swaying gently in the breeze, the fading light casting long shadows on the ground. For a split second, I felt a twinge of unease, but I shook it off. I was just overthinking as usual. The inside of the cabin was simple. A small kitchen, a living area with a stone fireplace, and a bedroom off to the side. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, not even a radio. Just me, a few books I'd brought along, and the wilderness. I unpacked quickly, setting my bag down in the bedroom before returning to the kitchen to make something to eat. The cupboards were stocked with basic supplies, canned goods, pasta, rice, but I'd brought enough food to last the week. As I cooked, I kept glancing out the window. The forest pressed close to the cabin, the trees dense and dark. By the time I finished eating, the sun had completely disappeared, leaving the world outside in deep shadow. I lit a couple of oil lamps and sat by the fire, trying to enjoy the silence. But the feeling of unease lingered, like an itch I couldn't quite scratch. I decided to call it an early night. The bedroom was cozy, with a heavy quilt on the bed and a small window overlooking the forest. I left the window cracked open for some fresh air, then crawled into bed and closed my eyes. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up. It was the kind of waking where you're not quite sure what pulled you out of sleep. A sound, maybe, or just a sudden awareness that something isn't right. I lay there for a moment, listening. The cabin was quiet, but the kind of quiet that feels heavy, pressing down on you. I strained my ears, trying to catch any sound, any hint of movement outside, and then I heard it, a soft crunch, like footsteps on the gravel outside. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Could have been an animal. There were probably plenty of them out here, but the sound had been deliberate, measured, not the quick scurry of a raccoon or the soft padding of a fox. These were footsteps, slow and steady, moving just outside the cabin. I told myself not to panic. It was probably a hiker, lost and stumbling across the cabin by accident. Maybe someone from a nearby property, though I hadn't seen any other houses on my way in. Still, I stayed perfectly still, listening. The footsteps stopped. My breath caught in my throat. I waited, the silence stretching out for what felt like forever. Then came the sound of the front door handle rattling. My blood turned to ice. Someone was trying to get in. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, my bare feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure it would give me away. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and pressed the power button. No signal. Of course. The door handle rattled again, harder this time. Whoever was out there wasn't giving up. I crept to the kitchen, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. There was a heavy cast iron skillet on the stove. I grabbed it, my fingers curling tightly around the handle. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The door suddenly went quiet. I stood there, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for the next sound. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Finally, I heard footsteps again, this time moving away from the cabin. I didn't relax. Not yet. I waited, listening to the footsteps fade into the distance. I counted to 100 in my head before I dared move again. Slowly, I crossed the room and locked the front door. Then I went to the windows, making sure each one was shut and latched. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the chair by the fireplace, the skillet resting in my lap, my eyes fixed on the front door. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind outside set my nerves on edge. I told myself it was over, that whoever it was had given up and left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching, waiting. Morning came slowly, the first light of dawn creeping through the trees. I stood up, my body stiff and aching from sitting in the chair all night. I checked the front door again, making sure it was locked tight, then peered out the window. The forest looked peaceful, bathed in soft morning light, but it felt like a lie. I needed to leave. The idea of spending another night here was unthinkable. I packed my things quickly, shoving them into my bag without bothering to fold anything. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. I felt like a trapped animal, desperate to escape. As I stepped outside, the morning air felt almost painfully cold against my skin. I scanned the clearing around the cabin, my eyes darting from tree to tree. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints, no disturbed gravel. It was as if the night before had been a bad dream. But it wasn't a dream. I unlocked the car, threw my bag in the back seat, and slid into the driver's seat. My fingers fumbled with the keys, my heart racing as I turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I pulled out of the clearing and onto the narrow dirt road, my eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. The forest closed in around me as I drove, the trees towering overhead. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something or someone was following me. I told myself it was just paranoia, that I was imagining things, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road, miles away from the cabin. Only then did I pull over, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I sat there for a long time, my heart gradually slowing, the fear ebbing away like a receding tide. I never found out who or what had been outside the cabin that night. I didn't want to know. I drove straight home and never looked back, deleting the cabin rental listing from my phone and vowing never to go back to the woods again. Some things are better left unknown. The crunch of gravel under my tires was the only sound as I pulled up the long driveway toward the cabin. It was late, probably close to midnight. The air was thick with that early summer humidity that clings to your skin. My headlights swept over the front of the cabin, illuminating the peeling paint and the sagging front porch. It wasn't much, but it was supposed to be mine for the weekend. A getaway. A chance to unplug and clear my head after the relentless stress of work. I killed the engine and stepped out. The stillness hit me immediately. No buzzing city noise, no honking horns, no voices. Just the faint hum of insects and the whisper of wind through the trees. I stood there for a moment, taking it in, before grabbing my duffel bag from the back seat and heading toward the porch. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, each grown loud and deliberate in the quiet night. I reached into my pocket, found the key the rental company had left for me in a lockbox, and let myself in. The air inside smelled stale, like the place hadn't been opened up in months. Dust hung in the air, catching the light from my phone as I used it to guide me to the light switch by the door. A single bulb flickered on overhead, casting a dim yellow light across the main room. The cabin was small, just a living area with an old couch and a fireplace, a tiny kitchen with outdated appliances, and a narrow hallway that led to a single bedroom and bathroom. It was rustic, sure, but it would do. I tossed my bag onto the couch and made my way to the kitchen, filling a glass with water from the tap. It tasted metallic and faintly of earth, but I drank it anyway, too tired to care. My phone buzzed in my pocket, no service. Perfect. That was the whole point of coming out here, after all. I set it on the counter and leaned back against the sink, staring out the small kitchen window into the darkness beyond. The trees pressed in close around the cabin, their outlines just barely visible in the faint light from the porch. I told myself I'd unpack in the morning. Right now, I just needed sleep. I grabbed my bag and headed down the hallway to the bedroom. The mattress was old and sagged in the middle, but it was better than the couch. I stretched out on top of the covers and closed my eyes, letting the quiet wash over me. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, a soft, rhythmic tapping. But as I lay there, my pulse quickening, I realized it was real. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from outside, near the front porch. I sat up slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. I strained to listen, but the sound had stopped. For a few moments, the only thing I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. I told myself it was probably a branch against the side of the cabin or an animal sniffing around. Still, I got up and walked back to the living room, peering out the front window. The porch was empty, just the old rocking chair swaying slightly in the breeze. I locked the front door, double-checked it, and then went back to bed. It took longer to fall asleep this time. Every creak of the old cabin seemed amplified, each one setting my nerves on edge. Eventually, exhaustion won out and I drifted off. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, and the cabin felt less oppressive. I laughed at myself as I made coffee, shaking off the unease from the night before. It's amazing how different things feel in the light of day. I spent most of the morning reading on the porch, the mug of coffee warming my hands as I listened to the birds and watched the occasional squirrel dart across the clearing. By midday, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The rental listing had mentioned a hiking trail nearby that led to a small lake. I threw on a pair of boots, grabbed a bottle of water, and set off. The trail was overgrown in places, but it was easy enough to follow. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the crunch of my footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. The lake was smaller than I expected, more like a large pond, but it was peaceful. I sat on a fallen log at the water's edge, watching the ripples dance across the surface. Time seemed to slow down out here. No deadlines, no emails, no constant notifications demanding my attention. Just the wind in the trees and the water lapping gently against the shore. On the way back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. About halfway up the trail, a section of the path had been disturbed. The dirt churned up, like something heavy had been dragged through it. I paused, staring at the marks. They were wide and irregular, cutting across the trail and disappearing into the underbrush. I told myself it was probably nothing. A fallen tree someone had dragged off the path, maybe, and kept walking. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. I made myself a simple dinner, pasta with Jared sauce, and ate it on the porch, watching the sky turn from orange to pink to deep blue. The air cooled quickly once the sun went down, and I found myself wishing I had brought a jacket. That night, I slept more soundly, the lingering fatigue from the hike dulling the edge of my nerves. But it didn't last. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't a sound that woke me, but a feeling, that prickling sensation you get when you know you're being watched. I lay there, perfectly still, my breath shallow. The room was dark, but I could just make out the faint outline of the window opposite the bed. The curtains were drawn, but a thin strip of moonlight bled through the gap in the middle. For a long moment, I listened. Nothing, just the steady thump of my heart and the distant call of an owl. Then, The sound returned. Not tapping this time, but a soft, scraping noise. It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the bedroom window. I sat up, my pulse spiking, and reached for the flashlight I had left on the nightstand. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the small room, but the sound had already stopped. I told myself again that it was probably an animal, a raccoon or a possum, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I got up and checked the window, shining the flashlight through the glass. The backyard was empty, just the trees standing silent and still in the pale light of the moon. I didn't sleep much after that. Every noise seemed suspicious, every shadow a potential threat. When dawn finally broke, I felt a rush of relief. I made another pot of coffee and sat on the porch, watching the sun rise over the treetops. The events of the night felt distant, like something I had imagined in the haze of half-sleep. But when I walked around to the back of the cabin later that morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. The ground beneath the bedroom window had been disturbed. The dirt churned up in a wide arc, and there, pressed into the soft earth, were footprints. Barefoot, human. They were larger than mine, and they led away from the cabin into the woods. I stared at them for a long time, my mind racing. Someone had been out here last night. Someone had been standing right outside my window while I slept. My first instinct was to call for help, but my phone was still useless without service. I thought about driving back to town, but it was a good 30-minute drive down a winding dirt road, and something about leaving the cabin unattended didn't sit right with me. Instead, I grabbed the hatchet from the firewood pile and kept it with me for the rest of the day. The hours dragged by, each one slower than the last. I tried to keep busy, chopping firewood, tidying up the cabin, anything to distract myself, but my mind kept circling back to the footprints. By late afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my bag, threw it in the car, and decided to leave early. Whatever peace and quiet I had come here for wasn't worth the growing knot of anxiety in my chest. As I drove down the long driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the clearing, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the cabin, small and lonely among the trees. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I pulled into a gas station and used their phone to call the rental company, reporting what I'd found. The woman on the other end sounded concerned but not surprised. "We'll send someone to check it out," she said. I didn't ask for details. I didn't want to know. I never went back to that cabin. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there in the woods that night. Maybe it was just a drifter passing through. Maybe it was someone who had lived out there for years, unnoticed and unseen. Or maybe it was something worse. All I know is that sometimes late at night, I'll wake up to that same tapping sound in my dreams, and for a moment, I'm back in that cabin, staring into the darkness, waiting for whatever's out there to reveal itself. I've been camping plenty of times in my life. I'm not new to sleeping under the stars, miles away from civilization, and enjoying the solitude that comes with it. This story isn't about some supernatural thing lurking in the woods, and I'm not here to spook you with ghost stories. This is real, terrifyingly real, and even thinking about it now sends a chill down my spine. It happened last summer. I was looking for a weekend getaway to clear my head, so I decided to head up into the mountains. There's this spot I've been to before, not too far from the state park, but secluded enough that I could have some peace and quiet. I packed light, a tent, some food, a sleeping bag, and basic camping gear. I didn't bother with anything too fancy. I figured 2 nights out there would be enough. The drive up was uneventful. The sun was high, and the sky was clear. Perfect weather. I parked my truck at the trailhead and hiked in about 4 miles to my usual spot, a clearing near a small creek. The water was always cold and clean, and the sound of it trickling over the rocks was one of my favorite things about camping there. It felt like nature's white noise, blocking out everything else. I set up camp quickly. My tent went up without a problem, and I gathered some firewood for the evening. By late afternoon, everything was ready. I sat by the creek for a while, just soaking in the peace and quiet. It felt good to be away from my phone, from emails, from people. Just me and the woods. As the sun started to dip behind the trees, I got a small fire going and cooked some dinner. Nothing fancy, just some canned chili and a couple of granola bars. The kind of meal that tastes better than it should when you're out in the wild. After eating, I leaned back against a log and watched the stars come out. The sky was pitch black, dotted with thousands of tiny lights. No light pollution out there, just pure, uninterrupted night. I must have sat there for an hour or two, lost in thought. Eventually, the fire died down to glowing embers, and I decided it was time to turn in. The air was cooler now, with a slight breeze rustling the leaves. I zipped up the tent, crawled into my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. That first night was uneventful. I slept well, waking only once when I heard something rustling outside the tent. Probably a raccoon or some other small animal. Nothing to worry about. I drifted back to sleep without a second thought. The next morning, I woke up early, just as the sun was rising. The light filtered through the trees, painting everything in a soft golden glow. I made a quick breakfast, instant oatmeal and coffee, then decided to go for a hike. There's a trail that loops around a ridge not far from my campsite, offering a stunning view of the valley below. I took my day pack, filled a water bottle, and headed out. The hike was peaceful. I didn't see another soul the whole time, just me and the forest. Birds chirping, leaves crunching underfoot, the smell of pine in the air. It was perfect. I reached the overlook around midday and sat down to enjoy the view. From up there, you could see for miles, endless green forests stretching out to the horizon, broken only by the occasional glint of a distant river. On the way back, I decided to take a different route. It wasn't marked, but I knew the general direction of my camp, and I figured it would be a fun little adventure. The terrain was rougher, lots of underbrush and fallen trees to navigate, but I enjoyed the challenge. Then I found the footprints. At first, I thought they were mine. I'd walked through this area before, so it made sense. But as I looked closer, I realized they were fresh. The edges of the prints were sharp, not softened by wind or rain. And they were big, much bigger than my boot prints. Bear tracks, I thought at first. But no, they were wrong for a bear. Too narrow, too human. A chill ran down my spine. I stood there for a moment, staring at the prints, trying to make sense of them. Maybe it was another hiker. But why would someone be out here off-trail, this deep in the woods? And why hadn't I seen or heard anyone? I shook it off and kept moving, telling myself I was overthinking it. People hike off-trail all the time. It's not that weird. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was low in the sky. The shadows were long, stretching across the ground like dark fingers. I was tired and sweaty from the hike, but more than that, I felt uneasy, vulnerable. I added more wood to the fire, building it up bigger than usual. As the flames crackled and popped, I sat with my back to the tent, facing the woods. My eyes scanned the trees, searching for, I don't know what, movement, a shadow, anything that didn't belong. Nothing. I ate dinner quickly, barely tasting it. The forest felt different now, less inviting, more watchful. Every little sound seemed amplified. The creak of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the gurgle of the creek. As the sky darkened, my unease grew. I kept telling myself it was all in my head. There was no one out there. No one was watching me. But logic only goes so far when your instincts are screaming at you. I stayed up late, feeding the fire and listening to the night. Around midnight, I finally forced myself to go to bed. I double-checked the tent zipper, making sure it was secure. Then I crawled into my sleeping bag and tried to sleep. Couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone or something standing just outside the tent, watching, waiting. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but that didn't help. My heart was racing, my skin prickling with fear. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Pale light filtered through the tent walls. The fire was nothing more than cold ash. I sat up, groggy and disoriented, but relieved to see the sun. I stepped out of the tent and froze. There were footprints, fresh ones. They circled my camp, weaving in and out between the trees. Not bear tracks, not my tracks, human tracks, big ones. My heart hammered in my chest. I spun around, scanning the woods. Nothing, no movement, no sound, just the wind in the trees. I packed up my camp in record time. My hands were shaking as I stuffed my gear into my pack. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to the truck was a blur. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me glancing over my shoulder. I felt exposed, like something or someone was watching me, following me. When I finally reached the truck, I threw my pack in the back and locked the doors. My hands were still trembling as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I pulled out of there without looking back. The drive home felt surreal. My mind was racing, replaying everything that had happened. The footprints, the feeling of being watched, the strange sounds in the night. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. I've thought about it a lot, tried to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was another camper, someone who got lost and wandered into my camp. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But deep down, I don't believe that. Deep down, I think someone was out there, watching me, waiting. I haven't been back to that spot since, and I don't think I ever will.